Well, it's now emerged that Sunday saw the highest global average temperature of the world ever since records were first kept from the 1940s. Normally, the average temperature assessed by taking temperature readings from all around the world at the same time is around 17 degrees Celsius on Sunday. That temperature moved up to 17.09 degrees Celsius. More important than that, it follows a trend that has seen the global average temperature moving higher over time in very small increments, but consistently in one direction. Professor Guy Midgley is a professor of climate change at the University of Stellenbosch. He joins us now. Professor Midgley, good afternoon to you. So we know the temperature is moving up. It's getting hotter. Is this the proof, really, that people have been looking for? There really can't be any argument now. The average temperature is the average temperature and it's going up.
Well, there's no doubt of that whatsoever. Thanks for having me, Stephen. It's just a continuation of a trend that's been ongoing for 3 or 4 decades and possibly a little bit longer. But the real issue that people need to possibly get a hold of is that the atmospheric temperature is more of a lagging indicator of what is going on.
So in other words, there are other indicators. I presume the oceans would be the other place that you would look.
Indeed. So if we were to look at leading indicators or indicators that are more sensitive, well, ocean temperature is definitely a major driver of atmospheric temperature, and oceans have absorbed about 90% of the additional heat that we've added into our biosphere, the place where we live. But the real leading indicator is atmospheric CO2 levels. And those levels now at well above 420 parts per million are higher than they've been in about 15 million years.
Sure. And I mean, is there any way to reduce that? I mean, if the trend's been going on for as long as it has, it's obviously not an accident, it's not a mistake, it's not a once-off. This is life now.
Well, that's precisely the issue. We are increasing CO2. We know how that is happening. And it is increasing faster than at any time in the last 100 million years or more. So this is almost a cataclysm in terms of the Earth's carbon budget and carbon cycle. We would need to turn this around very rapidly to try and cool the world down again. But what's going on essentially is that we're warming ourselves out of an ice age. The world that we know has been in an ice age for about 2.8, 2.6 million years. And we are now rapidly warming the Earth out of that ice age. And that is the fundamental nature of the change that we're imposing on our planet.
We've seen all of these big conferences that set targets, and I'm talking about the COP conferences every year, every 2 years. And first they said the global temperature should not move, what was it, more than 1 degree Celsius above the pre-industrial average, then 1.5 degrees, then 2 degrees. Are all of those targets now being missed? I mean, this is the temperature. Is this how we assess whether or not we're missing those targets? This a temperature of this global average of 17 degrees Celsius?
That's correct. I think in the long term, the long-term aim has always been below 2 degrees. So 2 degrees below the long-term average. But in Paris, the agreement was to drop that to 1.5 or as close to 1.5 as possible. But the challenge is that the CO2 level, in a way, is ahead of the temperature. So if we were to just allow CO2 to continue to increase, we would blow well past 2 degrees, probably 3, and maybe even 4 degrees. So we have to really reduce emissions very fast and ultimately find a way to draw CO2 back out of the atmosphere. But it looks as though we're probably going to overshoot the 1.5 degree target and hopefully not the 2 degree target, but there will be a period of overshoot. And that raises all sorts of questions about how we adapt to that period of overshoot and whether we entrain certain processes that we can no longer stop, like ice melting.
There have been some suggestions about ways to stop this, and I'm not just talking about, stopping coal-fired power stations. Some countries have been planting hundreds of thousands of trees. In Brazil, for example, the president there, President Lula da Silva, has banned some of the burning of the Amazon rainforest, things like that. Do those make a difference at all?
I think stopping deforestation can make a difference, does make a difference. Reforesting existing forests or forests that have been degraded can make a difference. planting trillions of trees on land that isn't naturally forested can have very adverse effects, though. So the big international push to plant trees over vast areas of Africa can have and do have very adverse consequences for our ecosystems, hydrology, human livelihoods, and in fact may even cause local warming, because the temperature or the color of the forest canopy is a dark color versus the grassland that those forests may replace. And so those grasslands which were reflecting energy into space then turn into a dark surface that absorbs energy and actually completely counteracts the CO2 storage. So we've got to look at these sorts of solutions that are imposed on us from developed countries with some suspicion. And Africa needs to be prepared to guard against being incentivized to do the wrong sorts of things. I call it malmitigation.
Okay. We saw our government yesterday, President Cyril Ramaphosa, signing the new climate change bill. It really puts an obligation on government to try and stop climate change. It also says that local government, in particular provinces and national government, need to prepare for climate change. Is that bill going to change anything?
Oh, I think it does. I think it will change a lot. There are a lot of new responsibilities on local municipalities, provinces, sectors to come up with adaptation plans. We need a national adaptation strategy. We need to develop adaptation scenarios. And there's certain institutions that have been put in place, also strong commitments around reducing fossil fuel emissions, commitments to a just energy transition. So this bill really it gives weight to South Africa's response to climate change, and it is an appropriate and measured response in relation to what more developed countries would do.
I think for a lot of people, I mean, we'll see these conversations, with people like yourself and other experts on it. We look at what government's doing, we look at all of the seemingly endless debates. I think they're sort of maybe about to come to an end about how we generate electricity, things like that. And people will think, well, I need to move around. I need to use a taxi or a bus or a car. I need to heat my home. I need to use a fire. I need to actually have a washing machine that works and have hot water. And I'm going to use coal-fired electricity or electricity generated from coal to do that. I mean, how can an ordinary person actually reduce their carbon footprint?
Well, many people in Africa have tiny carbon footprints, so they shouldn't be under any obligation to reduce their carbon footprint. It's a tiny fraction of the average world carbon footprint. In South Africa, it's a bit different. We have a huge inequality issue, so rich people would have a much larger carbon footprint than people who are living in poverty, for example. But essentially, for all of us, the system, we need a systemic shift. So once Eskom switches from coal and fossil fuels to more renewable energy sources, that helps everybody achieve carbon targets. So that's really where we need to go, so that we are given the choices as consumers to, for example, buy electric cars without threatening the energy grid. And it's those systemic changes that really need to happen to enable all of us to meet these objectives and to preserve the planet for our children and grandchildren.
Do you think the message is getting through? I mean, I think there's some indications that it really is now.
Well, I think one of the things that's really started to hammer home the messages is these extreme events, really unusual and extreme wind events, flooding, heat waves all over the world. People are losing their lives, sadly, in climate extreme events. There's no climate event that happens around the world now that is not in some way affected by climate change. So we are living in the age of consequence already. And the faster we learn how to adapt, the better. And learning to adapt to extreme events is one way in which we're going to have to learn really, really fast.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Guy Midgley. Really do appreciate the time. Professor of Climate Change at the University of Stellenbosch. And of course, this is a conversation that just leads to more and more sort of predictions about our future.